Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. And just let me say right out of the bat, today's question, we are not going to be able to answer adequately, in my personal view, within the time constraints we have. It's a question that's worthy of a deeper discussion, and perhaps we can have that later. But in this context, and I just want you to know, I'm not going to be able to give it the traverse all of the issues that probably we need to in answering it. And of course, now you're wondering what the question is, so let's jump straight in. Thinking of Posie Parker, as a Christian, where is the line for freedom of speech and preferring the needs of others? For those of you who watch this from overseas, this has to do with Posie Parker. I don't know her real name. I have heard it. She wasn't someone I was familiar with until recent events here in New Zealand. She's an ardent feminist who advocates passionately for women. And in particular, recently, she's been doing a speaking tour where she's been advocating for safe spaces for women that are free of transgender people. And equally, she's been advocating for safe spaces for transgender people. And she's not anti-trans. She's just saying that, hey, as women, we need a space which is set aside for us. And as trans people, they need a place that's set aside for them so that they don't have to worry either. But of course, in what has become our society, this has been taken out of context. It's been construed to mean all sorts of things that it wasn't meant to mean, in my view, and it's become quite aggressive, quite hurtful, and that there's been some really vocal pushback that culminated here in her people trying to get her visa to enter New Zealand to speak cancelled. When that failed to happen, they became quite aggressive in protesting a rally where she was speaking at, to the point where she was something was thrown on her. Her personal safety was physically threatened, and the police finally said to her team, "Hey, you better get her out." And so it's against that backdrop this question's been asked. Where is the line of freedom of speech and preferring the needs of others when it comes to us as Christians? That's a good question. Well, I guess before I sort of answer that, where is the line, I think one of the things we need to acknowledge as Christians is that freedom of speech isn't an absolute right. It's not an absolute right. I think, in fact, when we talk about freedom of speech, and I know there are various views on this, I think Christians should be very vocal in their when they defend freedom of speech, being very clear that there are limits around it. It's not an absolute right to be able to say what you want. The Bible doesn't draw that. The Bible doesn't talk directly about freedom of speech one way or the other, but it does talk about how we should speak. So, for example, in Proverbs 19:10, it talks about too much talk leads to sin, but those who control their lips are wise. In other words, if you just say what you want, it's going to cause conflict. It's going to cause sin. Whereas those who recognize that there has to be some constraints, some restraints, there's wisdom there. Likewise, James talks a lot about how the tongue is incredibly damaging if not harnessed correctly. So when we talk about freedom of speech, there has to be some boundaries. But those boundaries, in my view, have to be sufficiently broad to allow diverging views. Otherwise, we can't have the type of robust dialogue that's needed to build consensus in modern society. It doesn't mean to say we all have to agree, but we have to be able to come to some understandings that allow for divergent viewpoints within certain parameters, because that's part of what makes a healthy society. So when we talk about freedom of speech, I'm very clear in my mind that it doesn't mean I can say what I want to say, that there are boundaries. And of course, it begs the question, where are those boundaries? And I think the Bible does give some direction to us, even though it doesn't clearly or specifically talk about freedom of speech. So, for example, in Exodus 20, verse 16, it says don't lie. And again, we see this in Ephesians 4:29. So the right to say what I want doesn't mean that I can lie. It doesn't mean to say that I can make up stories about other people in order to bolster or try and strengthen my viewpoint. I can't just say whatever I want to. Likewise, in Ephesians 4:15, we're told don't speak in hate-filled ways. And again, Titus 3:2 says something similar. So there are some boundaries around what we can say when we exercise our right to be able to express our viewpoints. And I think these are important because we saw in the weekend, for example, how these were transgressed quite freely depending upon people's agenda. So, for example, I never knew about Posie Parker until I heard about her in the media, so I Googled, and that's when I found out that she's actually a feminist, very staunch feminist advocating rights of women, and trying to uphold and elevate the rights of women for women over anything else. And I get that. I may not share some of her viewpoints, but I understand where she's coming from. And yet when people took issue with her, they lied. They had the right to take issue with her, but the way they did it was they lied. They began to use an event, for example, in Melbourne, and say that she instigated violence. Well, no, she didn't. There was a group there who was using her platform for their own ends, neo-Nazis. She wasn't advocating their belief system or anything like that. They were using her positions, and I think, to be fair, probably taking it in ways that she wouldn't have pushed it, or wouldn't have felt comfortable having that viewpoint used. And people who opposed her used that as a part of their arguments to try and have her visa cancelled. Now, I think that's dishonest. And, I will agree with anyone's right to freedom of speech within boundaries, but that one of them is you can't lie like that. You can't be blatantly twist the truth to try and strengthen your argument. And again, you can't speak in hateful ways. And again, we saw in the weekend that, if you disagreed with people who'd had very strong views about trying to elevate transgender community to the same level as some other people, then if you disagreed with that, or disagreed where they wanted to draw boundaries, they would retaliate very hateful in very hate-filled ways. And we saw that in the weekend. And I don't think that's freedom of speech. I think that's anarchy. I don't think that's a really helpful thing. So in response to your question, as a Christian, where is the line for freedom of speech and preferring the needs of others, which is again what Paul talks about, considering others as and esteeming others as better than ourselves. I want to say that the line is where the way you speak becomes disrespectful or aggressive towards others, or the way or where you try and shut other viewpoints down because they disagree with you. I think once you go down that road, you've crossed the line. I think respectful dialogue, I think freedom of speech doesn't mean to say everybody has to agree, but they do have to respect opposing viewpoints and recognize that the thing that gives someone the right to hold a particular view gives someone else the right to hold a divergent view. We're not talking about whether those views are valid or truthful or that, but we're saying that we need to recognize that how we express ourselves has to be played out within boundaries that have to do with truthfulness and respect and everything else. And that applies not just for the extremes of left and right, but sadly, I think for Christians, we need to take that on board too. We can't just speak in ways of those we disagree with that are hateful or dishonest. We can't speak disparagingly or in deliberately hurtful ways of others just to try and strengthen our position. No one has the right to do that biblically, in my view. But I'm aware of time, but just let me quickly say that I'm not sure that what we saw in the weekend was about freedom of speech ultimately. I think what the weekend showed us was more of a conflict of worldviews, and one in particular that is increasingly vocal and even aggressive at times towards others that don't share it. I think what it helps us see, sadly, is how Western society has moved away from a position of tolerance based on truth to where truth has become relative, and which has allowed people to become very aggressive in their drive to try and assert their truth over someone else's truth. And that's very dangerous. What gave rise to tolerance was this recognition that truth is objective and we can approach it from different perspectives, but nevertheless, it critiques us. And once we got rid of that and made it relative, then we really can make it say or be whatever we want it to be, which means that then, sadly, it sort of empowers me to say my version's the correct version. And so tolerance has gone out the window and people have become very aggressive, very militant. And that's a very dangerous place to be. There's so much we could say about it, but time doesn't permit us. But so it's a great question. I think it's a question which we're going to have to wrestle with again and again and again in the times in which we find ourselves. And would be my hope for you, as it is for me, that in seeking to engage those who have divergent opinions, that we would do it respectfully, honestly, and humbly, because that's the example we find in scriptures. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Why don't you post your thoughts in the comments below? As always, as our time draws to an end, you can ask your questions about faith and life on slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC23. We'll love to hear from you. But that's all for now. Until next time, God bless.